Hello, this is Jason. This is my YouTube channel. In this video, you're going to learn about 5 points. And you're going to hear from Tyler Anbinder, who is a professor at Columbia University and the author of 5 Points, the 19th century New York City neighborhood that invented tap dance, stole elections, and became the world's most notorious slum. 5 Points was a neighborhood in New York City in the 19th century. Located in Lower Manhattan, 5 Points was infamous for its poverty, prostitution, corruption, and high debt rate for its inhabitants. 5 Points also happened to be the home of thousands of immigrants, many of which came from Ireland.
5 Points was a neighborhood of New York City in Lower Manhattan, just north of City Hall, and it became in the early to mid 19th century the most famous or infamous immigrant neighborhood in the city, renowned for its poverty and riotousness and all sorts of things. And then how I became interested was, it's kind of a long story. My first book was about the anti-immigrant Know Nothing Party from the 1850s. And I decided after writing a book about hatred of immigrants, I should write something from the immigrant's point of view.
No history of Irish immigration can be told without discussing the Irish potato famine. An estimated 2 million Irish people made the long and hard journey to North America during the famine, with 1.5 million of them landing in the United States. Having survived the famine and journey across the Atlantic, many settled in the first place they could. Some settled in Boston, Philadelphia, but the vast majority stayed in New York and into its poorest neighborhood, 5 Points. New York was now in the midst of a massive refugee crisis. Upon arriving into 5 Points, the Irish were thrown into a melting pot of poverty. 5 Points was home to the poorest of white American society and slaves who had themselves traveled from the south. They were soon joined by Italians and Chinese. Living conditions were awful. Sewers ran right through the middle of the street. Drinking water was polluted. In the winter, people froze to death in the cold. In the summer, people overheated. They took to sleeping on the streets if they could. 5 Points even became a tourist attraction, with Davy Crockett once visiting to confirm its horrors. Those from upper classes would pay visits to 5 Points to take part in slumming, where a police officer would take them on a whistle-stop tour to gaze at the residents. Most appalling of all were the women of 5 Points, who actually partook in the drinking of alcohol in groceries and dance halls. This was a new phenomenon and was of a lot of interest to those upper classes. Women also offered prostitution as a way to make money. There was once a brothel in every building on Mott Street.
The typical woman fleeing Ireland during the famine would not have lived in 5 Points, because most of the women who came to America would have gotten jobs as domestic servants in the households of more well-to-do Americans. And so most Irish women didn't live in 5 Points, they lived in the homes of their employers.
Right.
So actually the women who lived in 5 Points were kind of atypical in that they are women who had already gotten married and had kids by that point. So the typical Irish famine female refugee would not have lived in 5 Points. They'd have lived all around the city wherever their employers lived.
And those women that did end up in 5 Points, then the married women or the women with children, I heard from your lecture again that they were quite heavy drinkers at times.
Sometimes, right. That was one of the things that made the inhabitants of 5 Points so notorious, was that, in Ireland, most of the immigrants who lived in a place like 5 Points couldn't afford alcohol when they lived in Ireland. But when they got to America, they found that alcohol was cheap, and you get a significant amount of alcoholism in 5 Points. And one of the more notorious things is that women drank in public in 5 Points. And so women would go to, you could go to a grocery and you could buy gin or whiskey or even beer at the grocery. And they would have bars in the grocery stores, and women could not drink in saloons in New York, but they could drink in groceries. And so that was something that kind of appalled native-born American sensibilities. I think people went on slumming tours because in the United States, which prided itself on its prosperity and on its relative economic equality, that the idea that there could be such poverty among in cities that were so rich, like America, like London, I think that fascinated people, and plus people wanted to see whether what they were reading about these places could really be true or not, that there could be so much open prostitution, that there could be so much public drunkenness, that people could live in such squalor. A lot of people wanted to know whether that was true or whether that was just the exaggerated writings of journalists seeking to make some money. I think that explains why plumbing developed, but it's a complicated phenomenon that I admit I can't fully explain.
Although crime and violence was an everyday occurrence in 5 Points, residents also lived in relative peace and normality. Although they had many differences, both blacks and Irish were equally despised and disgusted by those better off. This is not to say that racism didn't exist within those communities also. Nowhere else in the world were black and white people living in such close proximity. They drank together, worked together, and danced together. Modern tap dance is said to have originated in 5 Points, a mixture of Irish dancing and black jig dancing. Master Juba, born William Henry Lane, a resident of 5 Points, was the first celebrity of his kind, traveling the world dancing with his new tap dancing style.
So, because the poorest New Yorkers lived in 5 Points, you have in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, you have a lot of Irish immigrants living there, but also a lot of African Americans living there. And because tenement apartments were so small and so crowded, people tended to socialize in their saloons and also in dance halls. Although these dance halls, you have to imagine, they're tiny by the modern, by modern conception. It might be a room that could be as small as a 12 by 12 foot room, or at the biggest, a room that was maybe 12 feet by 20 feet. And then you've got a band in there, and then you've got a bar in there, and then you've got a tiny dance floor. And the city's African-American residents were very proud of their dancing skills, and the Irish immigrants were proud of their dancing skills. And so at some of these dance halls, you would have the Irish and African-Americans showing off their favorite moves and their best dances and competing with each other. And I believe that the way that tap dance developed was in these 5 Points dance halls where traditional African-American dance and traditional Irish dance, which was kind of more high-stepping, jig-like, and that an African-American dancer named whose stage name was Master Juba, took elements of the two and combined it and created what we now consider tap dance.
The neighborhood would go on to house criminals and gangs, including the 5 Points gang founded by Irishman Paul Kelly, who would eventually be led by the likes of Al Capone and Lucky Luciano. 5 Points developed to become Little Italy and more recently Chinatown. Many tenement buildings dating from the late 19th century still line the streets in the area.
You should go to 5 Points. It's still there, and parts of it have been torn down, but parts of it are still there. I just did a walking tour of 5 Points yesterday.
Wow.
With a group. And so you can go, for example, to 65 Mott Street, where you can see the oldest building built for the purpose of being a tenement. In fact, the first brick building built for the purpose of being a tenement, which was built in 1826 and is still there 96 years later.
Wow.
Still standing. And so many parts of the neighborhood look a lot like they looked, maybe not at the time of the famine in 1845, but by the end of the 20 years after the famine, by 1865, a lot of the neighborhood still looks the same. And you can go to the actual 5 Points intersection, where there's now a park where the worst tenements used to be. But if you bring a couple of old, if you look on your phone for a couple of old photos of 5 Points and then stand there, you can really get a sense of what the neighborhood looked like.
Wow, that's amazing. Hopefully I'll do that soon. Okay, Tyler, thank you so much for your time.